Yeah, so going up to the Norman Rockwell Museum sometimes, just hearing all this stuff. It's beautiful. It's a spiritual component to it. And I was telling Gloria and Jonathan, a few of the folks at dinner, that another hat I wear, as he said, is a professor at CCSU, so I had sort of a bittersweet morning where I had the opportunity to moderate the Democratic Senate debate. And that was what I tried to do politically myself 4 years ago. So here I was on the other side of the microphone talking to these folks and asking Susan Beisowitz and Chris Murphy the tough questions. It was still, for me, empowering just being part of the game and be able to challenge them on some issues I care about. I spent a lot of time talking about Iran, which we may want to do in a little bit. What I'd like to do today, if I could, is just tell you a little bit about my journey through the Middle East and what it means and how it plays into the seminary. I mean, my main life has been more involved in the media, as Jonathan was saying. My spiritual roots are a little shallow. I was wishing that Ralph Ahlberg was here. I don't know if some of you know Ralph Ahlberg. He was my minister at the Round Hill Community Church about 30 years ago. When I had first moved to very Republican Greenwich, Connecticut, and I told my wife Andy it'd be nice to join a church. We've got a little daughter, Emily, who was 3 years old at the time, and I think a community church would be wonderful because people of all faiths were represented, and it was sort of what we were about. Talked to Ralph, and Ralph, was known to preach with a Bible in one hand and the New York Times in the other, so that sounded pretty good to me. And so he said, well, come in. I want to welcome you and your neighbors, to the Round Hill Community Church. So I said, we're great. We got up there, and he led us, the four of us, in front of the entire congregation one day, and he said, now I want to introduce our new parishioners. We have Carrie, she's a Greek Orthodox. We have Alex, he's a Lutheran. And we have Annie, my wife, she's an Episcopalian. And we have Ned, he's a Democrat. And they all thought that was too much. And so I learned pretty quickly that politics doesn't stop at the vestibule of the church. And then on my way out with Ralph, I've got to remind him of this because I don't know if he'll remember. I was walking out just chatting with him, and one of the wags came up and said, look at that. The man who talks to God and the man who talks to God. That's one of the things I love about the Hartford seminaries. I've just spent a little bit of time with you. Is there's too much in this world that divides us apart, and people don't work hard enough to find what we have that bring us together. And politics, doing that debate today, you've got to draw a contrast, and you've got to create differences, and our consensus is beginning to fall apart a little bit. Hartford Seminary, you see around the world how religion, instead of binding us towards our common humanity, often tends to separate, and often tends to create sectarian divisions. And what little I understand of the seminary, one of the things you do, we had dinner today, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, is our shared humanity and what we have in common, what we share both in this country and around the world. And with that shared sense of humanity, what a different place it would be. And as Jonathan said, I've spent most of my time in and around media. And media used to be more of a shared experience. Years ago, where you remember Walter Cronkite, the voice of God. That's the way it is. April 24th, 1967, and that was a shared commonality. And dictators use that same type of centralized media. I mean, in the old Soviet Union, you were 5 times more likely to have a television set than you were a telephone because everybody was watching the same shared experience. Same thing in the Middle East, where the emirs would, control the television, and their idea of entertainment was being able to see the emir, cut the ribbon on TV between 6 and 9 at night when it was on. That was the only thing, that you saw. And even the media today is fragmented. You know, here in this country, you've obviously, you know, you've gone from having the shared TV experience to now you're either MSNBC or you're Fox News, and you're getting your ideological foxhole, or you move over to either Huffington Post or Drudge. And what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about how media has transformed the Middle East. Because it was in my role as cable television guy that 30 years ago I was first invited to the Middle East. I went to Bahrain and Kuwait, where the emirs were very anxious, this is in the mid-1980s, that they were losing control over their media. And at that point it was videotapes, bootleg videotapes, sneaking across the border. People watching this on their VCRs. And they said, look, we've got to provide our people who want more choice, more options. So we looked at designing cable television systems for them. And war and inertia, that didn't happen. But then they launched Arabsat in the late 1980s. And that was going to be a satellite, which is a great programming warehouse in the sky. And all of a sudden, there was more programming choice. And all of a sudden, the first of the really prominent satellite news networks was created called Al Jazeera. I think you've all heard about Al Jazeera. And it exploded in popularity very, very quickly. And the dictators tried to do everything they could to stop it. Saddam Hussein in Iraq and the Ayatollah in Iran, they sent their goons out. And every time they'd see a satellite dish in the, this is the late 80s, you know, they would have their guys go and tear up the satellite dish and follow the coaxial cable down to the TV and take out the TV and penalize these people for the illegal crime of watching the satellite feed. Well, obviously that didn't work. I mean, the genie was out of the bottle and the satellite feeds were everywhere. Saudi tried to stop it. Saudi, they were a little more clever. They took a reading of the Quran and they would broadcast that on the very same channel as one of the satellite services would be, and they would try and jam the channel that way. And they also tried in Saudi to kick out the journalists who were reporting for places like Al Jazeera. Saudi had there was a, you know, in Fox News they say, we report, you decide. Well, in Saudi Arabia they used to joke, you report, we deport, meaning if you crossed our paths, we're kicked. Well, that didn't work, and the satellite services exploded. And Saudi, instead of trying to compete with Al Jazeera, they created their own satellite network. These are all news networks, by the way. These were news-hungry people desperate for information. And they created Al Arabiya. Hezbollah created Al Manar. The United States of America said, we got to get in this game. The US of A created Al Hurra, its own Arabic satellite channel. And, you know, today I can tell you that Al Jazeera is probably the fastest growing network in the world. And not only throughout the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and there are two networks that are giving it a real worldwide competition. It's the leading news networks in the world. One is CCTV, which is the Chinese Communist Television Network, and the other is CNN. You know, I know in this country that you're 3 or 4 times, maybe not this crowd, but nationwide, you're 3 or 4 times more likely to watch Fox News than you are CNN. But around the world, CNN is still the gold standard, and that's what people watch. You know, the ironic thing is, Al Jazeera, given its extraordinary popularity, it's in English, it's in Arabic, it's in other languages, is seen in almost every country on earth except one. The United States of America. You know, here, the land of freedom, generally speaking, there's not one cable operator in the country that offers Al Jazeera as an option. You can get it online, you can stream it, you can find it in other different ways, but generally speaking, it's not available. And the ironic thing is that every time I go to Israel, I watch Al Jazeera. It's on every single cable system in that country. And I'll tell you a little bit. I was in Israel a couple of years ago, And I said I wanted to go down to Gaza. As Jonathan said, I was on the board of an NGO called Mercy Corp that does an awful lot of economic development work. And ever since the Senate campaign with Joe Lieberman, where America's place in the world and our standing in the Middle East and how we intersected with folks in the Middle East was so important, I wanted to stay involved. So I joined this group, and I said, I'm going down to Gaza. We have a big program. And the Israelis said, you can't go to Gaza. You know, it's actually illegal to go to Gaza. Israelis are not allowed by law to go to Gaza. It's too dangerous. It's a terrorist haven. It's a hostile haven. And I said, well, I've been invited to go, and I'm going to go. By the way, Americans aren't allowed to go to Cuba, and everybody else goes to Cuba, so don't get too huffy. But we drive down to the Ezra Crossing, which is only about an hour and a half from Tel Aviv. Gentleman knows it's easily accessed, and then you go through all your paperwork, which is quite severe. It's a large military structure to get into Gaza, and finally you walk through, and there's this long corridor. Has anybody been there, by the way? You've been to Gaza. You remember to go through the Ezra Crossing? That long corridor you go. Erez Crossing. And then you go into this concrete chamber. And the front door is closed that leads you into Gaza. And you walk in from the Israeli side, and it closes behind you. And there you are in this locked-in room. And you're about, being an American, you're about to start making some sarcastic comment about bureaucrats or things like that. And you look at the TV cameras up there, keeping a close eye on them. And after about 20 minutes, it was really moving. We finally started talking to folks, and it's mainly NGOs. It's mainly these heroes that work around the world, making people's lives better. And that was mainly the folks that are going into Gaza the day that I was there. And finally, the door opens on the other side, a large garage door, entering into Gaza. And you hop in that car, and you go fast to get to move. And it's only about 5 miles across Gaza. You probably remember. You go into Gaza City, and it was remarkable. I went, they had a group of about, 50 or 60 young people, 16, 18, 25 years of age. And we just started talking, and they really wanted to know about politics in the United States, or so I thought. And I told them about political race in the United States. I told them about Palestinian settlements and Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and these young people from Gaza who really didn't get to see many people from outside of Gaza. It's a large, walled-in, open-air prison in many ways. They were getting a little bored with me. And they were looking out the window, and I looked out the window, and there were just lots of young students, all walking around great piles of sand on many of the street corners. Maybe you remember this, left over from different tank warfare that has happened before, some open sewer, but they're all in lines, dutifully walking on their way to school. And so I was looking at these young people looking out the window, and realized I wasn't quite connecting. So I just said, well, I got to tell you something, Annie and I have 3 kids. I got 2 daughters. They're 17 and 21, and they tell me more than I ever need to know about everything, more than you can imagine. And I got one son, he's about 14 at the time. He doesn't say much at all. And I looked and I waited for a second, and then this young girl from Gaza raised her hand and goes, my brother never talks either. And all of a sudden, we had a connection. And you realize the little common humanity you got. It's the same in politics it is when you're traveling around the world. More than anything else, people want to know who you are. And we started talking, and the women, many of the women loved Oprah. They watched Oprah Winfrey. You can't leave Gaza. So there's a lot of television viewing. And what I love about Oprah, in Saudi, by the way, they have tea parties. In At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, people sit down every weekday and they watch Oprah, which you might think is a totally American experience. They said, you know what I love about Oprah is she's thinking all the same things as we are. Just the same things. You're American. She looks so funny. And we're thinking the same things. And you know what's worse? She can talk about it. She talks out loud about it. I can't believe that. Another young man, he said, you know, my favorite TV show is Mr. Lamont. It's called Prison Break, which I thought was ironic since Gaza is surrounded by walls. And I might say it's surrounded by walls on the Israeli side and the Egyptian side. So it's Arab as well as Israel that keeps Gaza pretty well cordoned off. And then they said, well, look, while you're here, Ned, why don't you go see the American University in Gaza? I said, well, I'd love to do that. I know about the American University in Beirut. I know about the American University in Cairo. And from my point of view, it's the best of the United States in what we do. And I went to the American University, a small university, not as big as the Hartford Seminary, but they educate, you know, a couple hundred people there, and it was destroyed. And I said, who would have destroyed this university? Why did they do it? And they said, well, back about 10 years ago, Hamas bombed it. And they bombed it because it was filled with thoughts that were contrary to what they thought should be taught here in Gaza. And then back in 2008, Israel finished off the American University in Gaza. And I said, well, why did they do that? They said because, you know, there were snipers, allegedly, in the ruins or in the buildings, and it was destroyed. So whatever the reason, you looked at the American University in Gaza, the last hope, and there it was, this rubble. I went on and talked to went to a small school with many kids, 5, 6, 8 years old, and they had crayon drawings. And a number of the crayon drawings I remember were Israeli helicopter gunships shooting at mosques. And I said, whatever you may think, there's nobody shooting at your mosque. I just don't believe that. And yet they said, whatever you believe, you know, maybe there were snipers in the turrets or whatever there was, that's what the kids believe. And that was sort of the sentiment that you saw in Gaza. But incredibly hopeful people. You know, the folks I met were angry, but you know what they were angry about? They weren't able to go take their education at the University of Cairo, where they had been accepted. And, but a place without great hope. Then last year I went to Tunisia for the 1-year anniversary of what was really the dawn of the Arab Spring. And I think maybe a lot of you know the story of the young vegetable merchant in that small town in central Tunisia who was a vegetable merchant with his cart. And either he hadn't paid for the permit, hadn't paid the bribe, I can't tell you what, but all I know is they took away his cart. And he went to the government building, and he had enough money to pay that so-called permit. And they said, too late, you can't have your cart back. And I think you know the story. He left, he doused himself with kerosene, and he immolated himself, and he died a couple of days later. And Al Jazeera and all the Arab media put this on every single TV screen throughout the Middle East. And this was the fuse that launched the Arab Spring. And I was there a year later, and there's a statue of the young guy's vegetable cart. And next to it are probably 5 or 6 throws that have been knocked over. And the tragic thing is, since that young man immolated himself a little over a year ago, a half dozen other young Tunisian men have immolated themselves in the same place. So as opposed to the hope and dreams that you have thought that this act may have inaugurated, there's also an extraordinary sense of desperation. That said, though, they got rid of the dictator, Ben Ali, in Tunisia, and more extraordinarily, within 30, 40 days, that message via Al Jazeera and via Twitter, via Google, and via Facebook was taken to the Tahrir Square. And we ended up in Tahrir Square meeting many of the, they call themselves revolutionaries, so meeting many of the revolutionaries who were there a year later. And they were describing what it was like there in Tahrir Square that January, where it was first the young men there standing up really to the police that were coming in. And then they said it was really important, they also got women there in the square. Then they got older folks to come there. They had to show that this was not a youth clique. This was an Egyptian standing up. And every step of the way, they were online with their brethren in Tunisia. And the Tunisians told them, they noticed this. They said, one, don't worry about the military. At the end of the day, the military are drafted. Think about this. And because they're drafted, they have brothers and sisters that come from villages just like yours. What you have to really worry about are the police force. That's Mubarak's police force. That's a police force that is owned and operated by the government. They're the ones you have to worry about. What they said was, you have to be very careful at night, in the middle of the night. That's when the police come and they try and clear out. So you've got to stay awake. You've got to do everything to keep your group awake all night long. And they said we started singing karaoke, and they cracked an Egyptian joke. They called it karaoke. But that's how they sang. They sang all night long to the moon to stay awake. And they said when they bring in the military vehicles, what you've got to do is put fruit, bananas, and anything you can in the exhaust pipes. You can get them to overheat. You can stop. And the people from Tunisia said if they use tear gas, just like they did with us, use onions and put that on your scarf, and that would help mitigate the effects. And it was those type of messages that were transmitted in real time throughout the revolution in Tahrir Square. And they said, watch out, they're going to shut down the internet, just like they did for us. But there'll always be hotspots, there'll always be Wi-Fi areas. So you'll be able to go, and you'll be able to stay in connection with us, which is what they did. And then they said, then we got a cell phone call. And you know who we got a cell phone call from? Your State Department, Mr. Lamont. Your State Department called, and they said, hey, can you do me a favor? We're watching all this on CNN, and there's a sign over there in the right-hand quadrant that says, down with America. Can you get that sign out of there? It's ruined the whole storyline we have for the Tahrir Square Arab. And they said, look, we'll take down the sign, but leave us alone. This is our revolution, not yours. That afternoon, this is a year later, we went down to a small coffee shop. And they had down underground areas. This is where a lot of the revolutionaries had planned and thought where they could get some privacy from the police. And one of the young men came up to me and he said, that everybody just wants a better future for their family and for their kids. I've stayed involved in the West Bank in Israel. And there what we do is we train an awful lot of Palestinians on the West Bank in terms of IT skills, information technology skills. That's sort of what my little company does. And we train them on software programming and such. So they are taking Facebook and Google and all those applications and giving them an Arabic face. And we're going to the Israeli technology companies and say, look, stop outsourcing to Bangalore. Why don't you outsource to Ramallah? It's right next door. You have some of the best Palestinian IT techs around.
And it's extraordinary what they can do. And by the way, maybe you don't want people going back and forth across that border, and the wall and the crossings take forever and it creates all these frictions. But there's a fiber optic cable, and electronically people can start working together, and they make a difference. On Sunday, I guess, I'm going to Turkey, and there Secretary Clinton's put together a delegation of sort of investors, small business entrepreneurs. I'm in that group, and we've got about 500 young Turkish entrepreneurs, all of whom have a dream to start up a little business someday. And our job is to coach and to mentor and give some ideas and maybe see a little bit of capital. And what's important for the United States, I think, is to stay engaged around the rest of the world. But how you stay engaged is what's so important. You know, as we disengage militarily from the Middle East, as we hopefully end two wars and don't get involved in another war, we can't just pull up the ramp and leave. And that's what I've been trying to do ever since that Senate campaign, and you know, over the last 4 years, is do that. And I think, in your own way, that's what the Hartford Seminary does. I mean, you help remind people what we have in common. And the more I've had the great opportunity to travel around the world, we have an awful lot in common. And I hope our diplomats, and our generals, and our people remember that every day. So, thank you. That's my thought.